Hello, friends, and welcome back to another Invisible Man reading. Today, I am reading Chapter 26, The Wicksteed Murder. The Invisible Man seems to have rushed out of Kemp's house in a state of blind fury. A little child playing near Kemp's gateway was violently caught up and thrown aside, so that its ankle was broken. And thereafter, for some hours, the Invisible Man had passed out of human perceptions. No one knows where he went nor what he did, but one can imagine him hurrying through the hot June afternoon, up the hill and on to the open downland behind Port Burdock, raging and despairing at his intolerable fate, and sheltering, at last heated and weary, amid the thickets of Hintendine, to piece together again his shattered schemes against his species, that seemed the most probable refuge for him. For there it was. He reassessed himself in a grimy, tragical manner about 2 in the afternoon. One wonders what his state of mind may have been during this time, and what plans he devised. No doubt he was almost ecstatically experted by Kemp's treachery, and though he may be able to understand the motives that led to that deceit, he may still imagine and even sympathize a little with the fury and attempted surprise must have occasioned. Perhaps something of the stunned astonishment of his Oxford Street experiences may have returned him, for evidently he had counted on Kemp's cooperation in his brutal dream of a terrorized world. At any rate, he vanished from human ken about midday, but no living witness can tell what he did until about 2:30. It was a fortunate thing, perhaps, for humanity, but for him it was a fatal inaction. During that time, a growing multitude of men scattered over a countryside were busy. In the morning he had still been simply a legend, a terror in the afternoon. But virtue chiefly of Kemp's dryly worded proclamation, he was presented as a tangible antagonist to be wounded, captured, or overcome, and the countryside began organizing itself with inconceivable rapidity. By 2 o'clock, even he might still have removed himself out of the district by getting aboard a train. But after two, that became impossible. Every passenger train along the lines of a great parallelogram between Southampton, Manchester, Brighton, and Horsham traveled with locked doors, and the goods traffic was almost entirely suspended. And in a great circle of 20 miles round Port Burdock, men armed with guns and bludgeons were presently setting out in groups of 3 and 4, with dogs, to beat the roads and fields. Mounted policemen rode along the country lanes, shopping at every cottage and warning the people to lock their houses, to keep indoors unless they were armed. And all the elementary schools had broken up by 3 o'clock, and the children, scared and keeping together in groups, were hurrying home. Kemp's proclamation, signed indeed by aid, was posted over almost the whole district by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It gave briefly but clearly all the conditions of the struggle: the necessities of keeping the Invisible Man from food and sleep, the necessities of incessant watchfulness, and from the prompt attention to any evidence of his movements. And so swift and decided was the action of authorities, So prompt, the universal was the belief in the strange being that before nightfall, an area of several hundred square miles was in a stringent state of siege. And before nightfall, too, a thrill of horror went through the whole watching, nervous countryside, going from whispering mouth to swift and search over the length of breadth of the country, past the story of the murder of Mr. Wicksteed. If our sup- if our sup- if our supposition that the Invisible Man's refuge was the Hinterdine thickets, then we must suppose that in the early afternoon he sailed out again, bent upon some project that involved the use of a weapon. We cannot know what the project was, but by the evidence that he had the iron rod in hand before he met Wicksteed is to me at least overwhelming. We can know nothing of the details of the encounter. It occurred on the edge of a gravel pit, not 200 yards from Lord Burdock's lodge gate. Everything, everything points to a desperate struggle. The trampled ground, the numerous wounds Mr. Wicksteed received, the splintered walking stick, but why the attack was made, save in a murderous frenzy, it is impossible to imagine. Indeed, the theory of madness is almost unavoidable, but Mr. Wicksteed was a man of 45 or 46, steward to London Burdock, of inoffensive habits and appearance. The very last person in the world to provoke such a terrible antagonist against him, it would seem the Invisible Man used an iron rod, dragged from a broken piece of fence. He stopped his quiet man, going quietly home to his midday meal, attacked him, bent down his feeble defenses, broke his arm, felled him, and smashed his head to a jelly. He must have dragged this rod out of the fencing before he met his victim. He must have been carrying it ready in his hand. Only two details beyond this was only two details beyond what has already been stated seem to bear on the matter. One is the circumstances that the gravel pit was not in Mr. Wicksteed's direct path home, but nearly a couple of hundred yards out of his way. The other is the assertion of a little girl to the effect that, going to her afternoon school, she saw the murdered man trotting in a particular manner across a field towards the gravel pit. Her her pantomime of his actions suggests a man pursuing something on the ground before him and striking at it ever and again. With his walking stick, she was the last person to see him alive. He passed out of her sight to his death. The struggle began hidden from her only but a clump of uh, beech trees and a slight depression in the ground. Now this is the present Winter's mind at least, lifts the murderer out of the realm of the absolutely wanton. We may imagine that Griffin had taken the rod as a weapon indeed, but without any deliberate intentions of using it in murder. Wicksteed may then have come by and noticed this rod inexplicably moving through the air, without any thought of the Invisible Man. For Port Burdock is 10 miles away. He may have pursued it. It is quite convincible that he may not even have heard of the Invisible Man. One can then imagine the Invisible Man making off quietly in order to avoid discovering his presence in the neighborhood, and Wicksteed, excited and curious, pursuing this unaccountably locomotive object, finally striking at it. But no doubt the Invisible Man could easily have disdained his middle-aged pursuer under ordinary circumstances, but the position in which Wicksteed's body was found suggests that he had the ill luck to drive his quarry into a corner between a drift of a stringing nettles and the gravel pit. To those who appreciate the extraordinary irresistibility of the irresistibility of the Invisible Man, the rest of the encounter will be easy to imagine. But this is pure hypothesis. The only undeniable fact for stories of children are often unreliable are the discoveries of Wixty's body done to death and the blood-stained iron rod flung among the nettles. The abandonment of the rod by Griffin suggests an emotional excitement of the affair, the purpose of which he took it, if he had a purpose, was abandoned. He was certainly an intensely egotistical and unfeeling man. But the sight of his first victim, bloody and pit full of his feet, may have released some long-pent fountain of remorse to flood for a time whatever scheme of action he had conceived. After the murder of Mr. Wicksteed, he would seem to have struck across the country towards the downland. There is a story of a voice heard about sunset by a couple of men in a field near Fern Bottom. It was wailing and laughing, sobbing and groaning, and ever again it shouted. It must have been queer hearing. It drove up across the middle of a in the middle of a clover field and died away towards the hills. That afternoon, the Invisible Man must have learnt something of the rapid use Kemp has made of his confidence. He must have found houses locked and secured. He may have loitered about railway stations and prowled about inns, and no doubt he read the proclamations and realized something of the nature of the campaign against him. And as evening advanced, the fields became dotted here and there with groups of 3 or 4 men, and noisy with the yelping of dogs. These men hunters had particular instructions as to the way they should support one another in case of an encounter. He avoided them all. We may understand something of his exasperation, and it could have been none of the less because he himself had supplied the information that was being used so remorsefully against him. For the day at least, he lost heart for nearly 24 hours, save when he turned on Wicksteed. He was a hunted man. In the night he must have eaten and slept, for in the morning he was himself again, active, powerful, angry, and malignant, prepared for his last great struggle against the world. And that's the end of chapter 26. Tune in tomorrow for chapter 27, friends. And don't forget to help us by subscribing to our YouTube. Thank you for watching. Bye.